In women's history, a basic question is simply this: where are the women and what are they doing? Where are the women when the kings meet with their governments to talk about the next course of action? Where are the women when army commanders send their troops into battle? Where are the women when the clergy preach their sermons? Where are ordinary women, not queens and princesses, not elite people who are famous figures, but where are ordinary women in the tapestry of history, and what are they doing? Well, this is an engraving by a French artist, Jacques Callot, who during the 30 Years' War made a famous series of engravings, 18 of them in all, called The Miseries of War. This is one of them. And so in this instance, the question of where are the women can be answered literally. Here she is, one of the women anyway, in the lower left-hand portion of the engraving. She's being grabbed by a marauder and probably about to be raped or murdered or both. And being victims of war is not just something that happened to women during the war. Both men and boys were also victims. But victimhood is perhaps the stereotypical role that comes most readily to mind when thinking about women in war. And this romanticized painting on the right, depicting the murder of Jane McCrae, illustrates the point. McCrae was a civilian killed early in the Saratoga campaign of 1777 during the War for American Independence. And an account of her death, which happened shortly after her death and spread like wildfire along the frontier of upstate New York, is that she was murdered and scalped by Native Americans allied with the British during this campaign. And this helped to inflame passions against both the Native Americans and the British for whom they were working, and did a lot to mobilize civilians to support the American army in its attempt to stop the British army that was advancing southward, and ultimately was stopped and defeated at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. So this was a big deal at the time. The story is not accurate. This painting by the American artist John Vanderlyn, made in 1804, shows the version that was famous at the time. But what we know afterward is that Jane McCrae was at the home of a neighbor, one Mrs. McNeil, and Native Americans came around, sure enough, and they captured Mrs. McNeil and Jane McCrae and were riding off with them. So American soldiers from a nearby fort gave pursuit and fired at the Native Americans and actually hit Jane McCrae, who fell from her horse. The Native Americans repelled the pursuing white Americans, and then scalped Jane McCrae, who was already dead, and then moved on. So there are elements of the story that are quite correct, and the story is awful enough in and of itself. But this painting really gets at an idea of women. A second idea about women is women as what's called the beautiful soul. And this is an image of women as evocative of the best values of society. Women are seen to be nurturing. Women are seen to be taking care of hearth and home, keeping the home fires burning, taking care of the children and so forth, while the menfolk go off to war. And this beautiful soul is basically symbolic of what needs to be protected in war. So, here are the best values of a given society, exemplified, symbolized by a woman. And then here are the men who are supposed to be her protectors. And that's how the stereotype of the beautiful soul operates. So here you have a painting of a young woman and a young man, and the young man is getting ready to go off to war, and she is consecrating his sword by kissing it. and he's got a rose. I mean, an image could not be more romantic, than it is. This is an evocation of the idea of the beautiful soul. Now, a third stereotype regarding women in war is that of the instigator. And this is an 1863 cartoon in a Northern news weekly. This is during the American Civil War, that's showing Southern women hounding their men on to rebellion. So it looks backward at 1861 and the beginning of the war. And the implication here is that women exploit the importance that men attach to being manly. And that perhaps the worst way to attack a man is to condemn him as a coward. So in this instance, a coward if he does not go off to war. And in Great Britain, at the beginning of World War I, to sort of jump ahead a little bit, British women placed white feathers in the lapels of civilian men they encountered on the streets, the white feather being a well-known symbol of cowardice. And this British cartoon shows a group of women who have cornered a man in civilian clothing and are saying, "You coward, why don't you enlist?" And the recollections of male victims of these kinds of incidents, which really did happen, suggest that they continued to feel this stain upon their honor well into old age. This was really a lasting blow to their psyche. A fourth notorious stereotype is that of the prostitute who services soldiers. Now, this stereotype is undeserved when applied to all women. When you sort of look at the place of women in war, to think of them as being prostitutes. But prostitutes during wartime did, of course, find many customers among soldiers taken from their communities for months and years on end. And this was a role recognized in armies, some of which, like the French army during World War I, established medically supervised brothels, medically supervised in an attempt to limit the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. And during the American Civil War, we're looking at this at a pass from the Office of the Provost Marshal in Nashville, Tennessee. That's like the military police back then. And what you see here is a license being granted to Ann Johnson by name. And she's listed as a public woman, that means prostitute, and she's licensed to pursue her avocation in the city of Nashville, having received a surgeon's certificate of soundness, meaning that they've checked her and they've been found that she's free of a sexually transmitted disease. So here's a license to be a prostitute, so that's sanctioned by the Army. I've said that the French Army had medically supervised brothels. In some instances, women were forced into prostitution is a terrible word in this instance. I would say sexual enslavement. The most famous example of this happened during World War II, when the Japanese army conscripted hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean women to serve as so-called comfort women, who were raped by Japanese soldiers. What is virtually unknown about women in war before the 20th century is that of women in the role of camp followers. The mention of the term conjures an image of prostitutes following armies, but in fact, women played an important role in providing logistical support to armies by taking care of the cooking, doing laundry, and mending clothes for soldiers. This engraving shows Scottish women as camp followers in a British regiment in the mid-18th century. And military historian John Lynn has made the closest study to date of women, armies, and warfare in early modern Europe. His research indicates that prior to 1650, the number of women and children following armies numbered in the thousands, sometimes to be near their husbands and fathers, sometimes for protection against marauding enemy soldiers, but always placed in the role of supporting armies in normally domestic roles. And their numbers could be immense. During his invasion of Italy in 1498, King Charles VIII of France estimated that he had to feed 48,000 to 50,000 mouths, as he called them, of whom just 20,000 were soldiers. The rest were women and children. Other reports also state that women and children often outnumbered combatants. And after 1650, as armies became more professional and capable of taking care of themselves, the number of camp followers was greatly reduced. But camp followers continued to serve, and the practice was eventually even sanctioned by armies. So that in a French battalion in 1702, there were 22 camp followers allowed for 500 men. So there was an understanding, we need help with cooking, we need help with laundry, we need help with mending clothes. And so we've had women in the past to do that. Let's continue to have women do it. In British regiments in North America during the French and Indian War, 6 camp followers were authorized per 100 men. So we're not dealing with trivial numbers here. The informal presence of camp followers continued as late as the American Civil War. This 1862 photograph shows a camp follower with her soldier/husband and their 3 children. There was also the phenomenon of the vivandière. In the 114th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, there was one Mary Teep who served as a valued vivandière, and that means that she cooked and served food to soldiers in the line, and served and heated coffee and served them that too. Another woman was a vivandière in the 2nd Michigan. We know of that as well. During the War for American Independence, camp followers were common, and these Revolutionary War camp follower reenactors describe their role.
Sometimes people ask, why would a soldier's wife living in Britain, or as I was in Ireland, where my regiment was before it came into the continent, why we would want to be a camp follower rather than staying at home. But some would come for love, to follow their husband. If you're from a poor family, as many soldiers were, life with a tent, a roof over your head, and food every day,
meals a day,
is no worse and sometimes better than what you had at home.
A soldier's pay was sporadic at best and never absolutely sure.
And they deducted many things.
And even if they received their pay, how was a soldier going to get pay back to England or to Ireland to provide for his wife?
Yeah, and children.
A woman would have no way to support herself if her husband was gone. She might be destitute, and so the best opportunity that she might have would be to follow her husband across the ocean and follow the army.
And think too how long it takes to get communication. So if my husband was injured in battle or worse yet killed, I might not find out for many months, if I found out at all. And nursing care in the army is so indifferent. And so if I can be here with him and he's injured, I can give him more attentive care than he would get from whoever might be there taking care of the injured soldiers, and I'll know his fate. And so those were all reasons why I would want to be here with him. And of course, there were children in the British Army camps as well. If a British Army wife was hired to come with the Army, if she had young children, they could come along. And
children tended to come along in the Army as well.
Absolutely, of course. The British Army was here 7-8 years for the American Revolution, so children would have been born along the way. I read about a census that was done of the whole British Army. I don't remember the year, perhaps 1780. And as I recall, it said there were 19,000 men in the Army at that time, almost 3,000 women, and nearly 2,000 children. So that gives you a sense of the proportions.
If the soldier's wife was upon the ration, in other words, if she were authorized to be in camp, her children also received a partial ration.
They did, that quarter ration.
Yeah. And they would probably receive some sort of education from a sergeant or another enlisted man who could read and write and teach children. Not all women were so fortunate, however. The Army allowed a certain number of women to travel with the Army, and other women may have found their way along with the Army along the way, and if they were not authorized to be there, then it was a whole different story for them.
They had to
fend for themselves entirely. They did not receive a ration.
Find their own lodging, their own way of supporting themselves. Documents seem to indicate that women camp followers were very active in smuggling rum and other liquors into the camp and selling them to soldiers, because there are many orders ordering them not to, so we know they were doing it.
Yes.
And I'm sure there were also women on the edges of camps doing other things that women have done in armies for thousands of years.
And as long as there have been armies.
And commanders are not so keen on that either, so I think it would depend on the individual commander how much leeway he gave.
I think in general the commanders frowned upon unauthorized women.
Sure.
Because of maintaining good order in camp.
It's a distraction to the men, yes.
And so I think that if you were not authorized to be there, that you were strongly encouraged to decamp.
I heard something interesting which was on the continental side. At the beginning, I believe, of the war, they did not have so many women in the Continental Army, I suppose because wives were staying home with their families and things. And one observer said that the Continental Army looked so much less clean. Their linen was so dirty because they didn't have laundresses to wash. And I heard that General Washington, later in the war, said that he felt obligated to hire on a lot of Army wives, because otherwise a lot of veteran old soldiers would just have gone home and not stayed.
And cleanliness was important, don't you think? That
yes, madam.
Perhaps in the 18th century they didn't know why, but keeping things clean keeps people in better health, keeps food from spoiling.
Indeed.
And it just is important in maintaining good order in the Army as
You need people to do the laundry, to keep vermin down, and to keep people healthy.
Click the subscribe button below and the bell icon to get notifications for new videos about George Washington and behind-the-scenes work at Mount Vernon.
Yeah, that's who did it. Mount Vernon put this film together, and obviously had the reenactors on their property. By the way, if you want to go to Mount Vernon, it's well worth visiting.